of you. Thanks to the library for hosting me. It's terrific. I have a confession. I never intended to write about John Farnham. Not out of any lack of respect for the man. I had great admiration for his music and his achievements. But if you look back through the work that I've done over the last 10, 15 years, I tend to gravitate towards stories that are perhaps a little bit darker, where people have, unfortunately, written the beginning, the middle, and the end of their stories. People like Johnny O'Keefe, Mark Hunter, Shirley Strawn, even the Bee Gees. You know, only one of the Bee Gees is surviving today. It makes a writer's life much easier, as morbid as that sounds, but it does, because you know how the story is going to end. Whereas when you're writing about someone who's still around, the end is up in the air, you know, it's unpredictable. So, but it wasn't just that. It was, I wasn't aware, certainly as a music writer, I was very aware of John Farnham's achievements, his music, what he's done over the last 50 years. I wasn't aware of the backstory. I wasn't aware of how he got to be where he is and what happened particularly between the heyday of Sadie and the Whispering Jack era where he really rebuilt his career. So I said to my publisher, because typically I will be the person initiating, I'll go to my publisher and say, I want to write about whoever I want to write about, and one time in 10, they say it's a good idea. This was a case where someone actually approached me, and I said, let me just go away and do some research and I'll let you know. And I came back within a week and completely had my mind completely changed about the guy. I said, absolutely, I want to write this story. The breakdown of the story is fairly simple. We're talking about a really humble working class guy, a 10-pound pom, who in the 60s was working on a building site and almost by accident became the king of pop. Had this supernova success, this really once in a lifetime type of success. Of course, for John it happened twice in a lifetime. But then once that Sadie era was over, his career really fizzled out. The 70s was a horrible time for John. But then through Whispering Jack and You're the Voice, 20 years down the line, his career took it was a completely different career. He'd gone from being a singer of, I guess, novelty songs to a serious singer. Probably our own answer to people such as, I don't know, I always think about people like Tony Bennett, you know, real singers. Whereas before John was seen as probably more of a teeny bopper idol. And what he went through, as I say, to get back on top, that was only half the story. The next part of the story was, what do you do once you've reclaimed that title? The last 30 years have been a case of John finding out ways to maintain his presence at the top. Because he's unparalleled. There's no one like him in Australian music history. All his peers, even those who are still making music, aren't performing at the level that he's performing. They can't sell out 20,000 ticket arenas and things like that. No one can do that outside of John Farnham in Australia right now. It's probably best to start with some stats. Oh, sorry, actually, when I was approached to write the book, this is a bit of a backstory. I contacted Glenn Wheatley, John's manager, who I've met through my work, and he's actually said a couple of times he really likes the way I write, which is very flattering. And I said to him, I've been approached about doing this. I'd love to write a book about John. How do you think he would react? Would he want to be involved? And he said, John has made it clear that he's more than happy for someone to write about him after he's dead. Now, which makes it really hard to interview the guy for a start. And while I respect that opinion, at the same time I thought he's doing himself slight disservice, because I don't think people outside of John's really hardcore serious fans understand the trials and tribulations of his career. And I thought it would be much better for people who know him to know about that while he's still around. Because nothing worse than going to someone's funeral and them finding out what they'd been through and gone, I wish I had the chance to say, well done, you know. So that was the attitude. Glenn said, go ahead and write it. He said, and in fact, Glenn Wheatley read the manuscript as I went along and steered me in the right direction and spoke very positively of the book. But it was one of those complicated situations where I think his lifelong commitment to John was a lot more important to him than, you know, some writer who's dropping into his life. So there's a funny story. Just recently, someone approached John after a concert and asked him to sign a copy of my book. And he said, that thing's a bloody nuisance. And they said, why? And he said, because I don't know anybody who's been involved with this, and I don't know who he spoke to. It seems that Glenn hadn't told John about our relationship. So I backed out of it very quickly, because it certainly wasn't the type of book. It's not, maybe unauthorized, it's not a, it's certainly, there's no skeletons in John Farnham's closet. Anybody who's seen him perform know how quite willingly he divulges lots of information about his married life, his kids, and all those kind of things, which to me is material that is fair to use. But there's no darkness. It's not like he has any secrets. He's a very public person. So it proved to be a great book to write. I'll start with some statistics. It's fair to say that John is the most successful and popular Australian singer of all time. He's recorded records. He's continued recording for 50 years. He's won 20 arias. Whispering Jack sold, I think it's at 1.5 million copies sold, which means a couple of us own a copy. I think at the time, I think it was 1 in 10 Australians owned a copy of the record. It's the highest selling Australian album of all time by streets, by hundreds of thousands of copies. He holds attendance records for the Sydney Entertainment Centre and the Melbourne Tennis Centre. I think he's played at both 77 times. Now, if you think about it, those venues hold, I think, 12, 15,000 people. So both of those venues, he's played to over 1 million people in both. He's such a figure at both of those venues that they have rooms named in his honour. He's been Australian of the Year. He was a Greenpeace spokesman in Russia, a tireless worker under the radar for a number of charities. He's performed for Aussie troops in Dili. He's dined at the lodge with Bob Hawke, where he raided Hawkey's wine cellar. Well, who wouldn't, right? He's collided with the Scacers, and he performed for several billion people at the opening of the 2000 Olympics, hand in hand, song to song with Olivia Newton-John, our very own female John Farnham, if you like. And legend has it that he had quite a few stiff drinks when someone told him how many people would be watching. It's part of the process. He's even played Jesus Christ. Superstar. It was not bad for a humble plumber's apprentice who as a kid was nicknamed Fatty Farnham. Now, I was looking for an opening for the book. I don't write books that begin with, I was born. I don't do that. That's not really my style. I like to throw the reader into a situation where in a few pages they'll get an idea of this person. Say if someone came to this book not knowing who John Farnham was, I wanted to capture a scene that had him in his prime. And I quickly explain how he got there, what was happening at that time in his life, and how he has the ability, in this case, to really change perceptions. I was at this actually. I'm going to read you a piece. It's from the Arias in 2003, and I was there. And at the time, I was still working. I worked for Rolling Stone magazine for a long time, and we were kind of caught up in this whole thing about you only write about the cool kids. And of course, John Farnham was never cool. However, on this night, in this passage I'm going to read you, it's a great example of how he can demolish this kind of supposed Berlin Wall that exists between cool and uncool. So I'll get into it. This is called, If You're Not Standing, You Have No Soul. John Farnham has never had much time for cool. It's fair to say the closest he came was in the mid-'80s, during Whispering Jack, when he had hair bigger than his voice and he dressed like a rock and roll stormtrooper, with a shin-bone-length dryzer bone and an upturned collar on full and bold display. It's fair to say that throughout most of his 6-decade-long career, he's always been family-friendly, G-rated, likeable, a little bit daggy, but in the best possible way, and hugely successful, at least most of the time. So here we are in 2003. He's deep into his 50s. He's a part of the old guard, the music business establishment. A survivor, a sort of aging sex symbol. Your gran would welcome him for tea and biscuits. But he was an uneasy fit at a time when every charting act seemed to boast multi-syllabic names. If you remember, it was Powderfinger, Silverchair, and they were all so damned ethical, they'd rather live in a garret and focus on their art than sell out by going commercial. At least that was the public perception anyway. These acts saw someone like Farnham and success on his scale, viewed it with a little bit of caution. It wasn't cool. And as I said to you already, I had to take some blame for perpetuating this myth as a writer for Rolling Stone. I was sort of swept up in the cold of cool, even though behind closed doors, my tastes ran to different music altogether. certainly Farnham, but people like Savage Garden. I'd much rather listen to them than, say, the latest rock band to come out of Fortitude Valley, with all due respect to Fortitude Valley. So I wrote about the hip, the edgy, the alternative. Yet, I never missed the chance to attend the arias. Sure, the next day I'd come into the office and moan about how all the deserving acts didn't get the rewards, the obvious one out, blah, blah, blah. But the reality was, it was a lot of fun. I guess I'd never quite shaken off my daggy suburban roots myself, just like John Farnham. I was always quietly thrilled to be surrounded by pop stars and rock heroes, household names, some who even knew who I was. How cool was that? But I didn't anticipate what would happen at the 2003 awards. But, pardon me. It might have been the night of nights for Delta Goodrem. If you remember, I think Delta Goodrem had just come back from being seriously ill, and she won a lot of awards. And that's, on paper, how people remember the 2003 arias. But as I saw it, it meant something else altogether. Towards the business end of the night, Rove McManus, TV's own John Farnham, if you will, stepped forward to introduce John Farnham. When it comes to our next performer, pardon me, they don't come any bigger than this. He listed John's successes and his achievements and said how that night John had been inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame. Now, that's a great achievement, but it's also the pop equivalent of the retiree's gold watch. It's, be careful what you wish for, right? Rove continued. The name legend, he said, gets thrown around a lot, but this man is certainly deserving of the title. The stage lights dimmed, and the crowd started to make some noise. They were excited, but they weren't quite sure what to expect. There stood John Farnham in a sharp black suit and black pants, his fair hair swept back, looking good, conservative, a little paunchy, but still pretty damned good. His guitarist stood to his right, just strumming an acoustic guitar. Together they began to sing You're the Voice, his signature song, but in a sort of low-key, unplugged style. It was hardly what you call a showstopper, but everyone in the room got the sense that John had something up his sleeve. Then suddenly the lights came up and his band kicked in. Keyboards, bass, drums, guitar. Farnham started to sing more passionately, strongly, and the audience, which never, ever leaves their seats at the arias because there's all this pricey booze on the table that you've got to consume, suddenly stood up. This is very rare, it does not happen, and started to move towards the front of the stage. Then, two bagpipers, kilts and all, appeared on stage, blowing their lungs raw as the voice built and built and built. And if you listen closely, the bagpipers are actually playing It's a Long Way to the Top, because Johnny is a huge AC/DC fan. The crowd was really in the moment now. Even all the jaded industry hipsters in the pricey seats were up on their feet. Some were standing on their chairs. Farnham's longtime manager, friend and true believer, Glenn Wheatley, beamed a smile from the audience. Behind him was Ian Dicko Dixon. If you remember, he was the flavour of the month as head prefect on Australian Idol. Even he started to dance, lost in the song. On stage, John powered on. Then even more pipers, perhaps a dozen in all, invaded the stage. There were bagpipes and kilts wherever you looked. And the audience lifted the roof right off the building. It was pandemonium. In the crowd, all those winners and grinners from night, all the coolest kids in town, forgot all about it. They forgot all about the booze on their table and their aria statuettes. They all were lost in this song, this kind of surrogate national anthem. They all stood awestruck, gazing at this guy on stage. Smiles lit up the faces of the crowd, who'd formed a mini mosh pit at the foot of the stage, which was unheard of at the arias. John responded with his signature microphone stand twirl. Anybody seen him do that? And at that moment, he threw it in the air, and I swear, as he caught it, he went, "I am so glad I didn't drop it." So the band crashed and clanged to a thunderous close, and everyone in the room, and there were thousands squeezed into the Superdome that night, was screaming, yelling, clapping, stomping. The applause went on for longer than the song itself. John beamed, saluted the crowd, waved his arms and said, "The band," bringing them into the applause. Finally, after minutes, Rove McManus strode back on stage, vigorously pumped Farnham's hand and said, "If you're not standing in this room or at home, you have no soul." And to me, it was a great example of how this seemingly daggy performer, to some people anyway, could bridge the gap between cool, uncool. It didn't matter. That song and his performance of that song, as he's gone on to prove, dozens of times, at concerts, at football, you name a big event, John's performed that song and it's changed everything. I think a good example of that is in 2009 at the Wave Aid concerts where he played with the band Coldplay. I don't know if anybody knows about this, but Coldplay, of course, being quite a contemporary band, but they were big John Farnham fans. And they had an audience of 50,000 people, and they brought John out at the SCG and the MCG for these tsunami benefit concerts, and basically said, here to sing Australia's national anthem is Australia's favourite son. And John sang You're the Voice with Coldplay backing him, and suddenly 50,000 Coldplay fans became 50,000 Farnham fans. It was really interesting to see. The band themselves just took a step back and said, it's all yours. It's an interesting site. It's well worth YouTubing. Now, to rewind time a bit, from having written a number of books now about particularly solo artists, there's really no such thing as a solo artist. They don't work in isolation. There's typically a lot of people in the background who help them become the star that they are. John's case, probably his first big supporter, this is going back to 1967, was a guy called Daryl Samble. Daryl at the time was managing the Master's Apprentices. Zoot, anybody remember Zoot? I think Zoot produced a lot, Rick Springfield and B. Birtles and someone came out of there. And a woman named Bev Harrell. What was really interesting, I did some research on her. I didn't know who Bev Harrell was. She turned out to be like a little Patty type singer, but Daryl Samble got her onto a Hills Hoist TV ad. Now, during the mid-60s, everybody had a Hills Hoist, right? It was one of the smartest bit of marketing I could ever imagine. Everybody watched the ad, everybody suddenly knew who this woman was. But what Daryl didn't have as a manager was a solo act until he met John. I'll just read you another passage. This one's called When Daryl Met Johnny. Daryl Samble was unlike any manager doing the rounds of the Australian entertainment biz in the mid-1960s. At 22, he was probably the youngest. He was opinionated, colourful, and ambitious. He craved success as much as the stars that he managed. As one client, future TV presenter Richard Wilkins would admit, Daryl knew how to get you all the publicity in the world, but he also knew how to send you broke in the process. He was notoriously high-strung. Once, allegedly, he pulled a pistol on a journalist with whom he disagreed. And thank God I wasn't writing at the time of this guy, I tell you. Now, Samble was never going to be a pop star himself. He wasn't that good-looking guy. He was certainly a background player. But he was a kind of a progressive type. He understood the word hype before the word hype even existed. And in early 1967, Johnny was playing in a band called Strings Unlimited. And they had a show in a township called Kahuna, which is about 300 kilometres north of Melbourne. Bev Harrell, who Samble managed, was on the bill that night. Bev and Daryl Samble walked into the venue, and before the show had started, and Johnny was seated at the drum kit, and Samble did a double take, like, who is this guy, And then he walked up to John, he said, you're not the drummer, are you? And he said, no, why? He said, oh, you're far too good looking for that. After the show, later that night when Johnny came off the stage after finishing his bracket with the strings, Samble pulled him aside to share some advice. When you go on later tonight, he said, could you sing a fast song and then do a couple of slow songs? John was very agreeable and said, of course, no problem at all. What he didn't realise was that Samble was sizing up his ability as a performer. It was like a surrogate audition. John was managed by someone else at the time. After the show, Johnny shared a drink with him, and it seemed nothing more than a friendly post-show get-together, two travellers hanging out, comparing stories. But Daryl had an agenda. He took Johnny's parent, John still lived at home, of course, he took Johnny's parents' phone number and promised to get in touch soon. Samble understood what was happening at the time. The late 60s was a golden age for attractive male pop stars. Ronnie Burns was a good example. He was becoming a star at the time. He used to be a window dresser at Myers store in Melbourne. Billy Thorpe had recorded Over the Rainbow and become a huge solo star before he grew his hair, took LSD and went a little bit wild. Normie Rowe, the Army hadn't got their clutches into Normie Rowe yet, and he was still singing hit singles. Russell Morris was about to become a solo star. Johnny Young had had a lot of success as a singer. It was, like I said, a golden age for young, good-looking male pop singers. Daryl, from that one experience with Johnny, knew two things. Johnny was prettier than all of them, and he could sing better than them too. He said that he sensed that John could become a sort of all-round entertainer, a super pop star. He had easy good looks and a natural boyish charm that could both break teenagers' hearts and win over their parents. That was rare. You could certainly not say the same of Billy Thorpe, right? I don't think your mother would welcome Billy Thorpe back to your place anytime soon. Samble envisaged Johnny branching out into television, into theatre, maybe even films. Anything was possible. Strings Unlimited broke up in July 1967, and Darryl quickly arranged a meeting with Johnny and his parents. Now, John's parents were solidly working class folk, really good, solid, suburban stock. And this guy walks in wearing a turtleneck and denim and bling and looking this is Samble, not Johnny, looking very flashy. And he sat down and he said, "I can make your son a star. He'll be the biggest entertainer Australia has ever seen." Now, this is a classic clash of cultures. Johnny's caring, solidly working class parents and this human live wire talking a huge game. Johnny's father was not convinced. John Sr. said, he's only 18. He's 2 years into his plumbing apprenticeship. What if it doesn't work? What if it all falls apart? What will he have to fall back on? Well, John eventually talks his parents around. And 50 years later, he still hasn't finished his plumbing apprenticeship. So, that says something. Of course, and then what happened? John signed with Samble. John recorded Sadie. Sadie was the first proper release that John Farnham made. Imagine that. Talk about starting with your aces. It became the highest selling Australian single of all time, not long after its release, outstripping, I think, Slim Dusty's Pub with No Beer. It was huge. Not long after that, and Darryl did what he promised. He got John into the theatre, and he was in a production called Charlie's Girl in Melbourne. And one day he noticed a young dancer named Gillian Bellman. The true story is he saw her legs first, and he was very much a leg man. Now, Gillian had no idea who this Johnny Farnham was. She was a dancer, a professional dancer, swept up in her own career. But she did notice this young guy with a great bum, a romance blossom. Now, it's worth knowing, Darryl Samble was horrified by this because any young male pop star is not meant to be attached, even if they are. Their manager doesn't want the public to know that. Typically, what will happen is their fans will gravitate towards someone who is at least allegedly single. Normie Rowe had just been conscripted into the army. He was gone. So the army had got Normie, and now Darryl was worried, God, a girl's got Johnny. What are we going to do? Darryl, it should be said, Darryl's relationship with Johnny went way beyond manager. He was incredibly protective, probably a little bit in love. Darryl was gay, probably a little bit in love with Johnny himself. So overwhelmingly involved in his career that he would iron John's clothes before he went on stage, and behind his back, people called Samble Sadie. Regardless of how meddlesome he was, and he was very meddlesome, in 1973, John and Gillian got married, and 44 years later, are still married. I mentioned before about key background people in John's life. His wife is definitely one of probably the key 2 or 3 people in his life. Darryl Samble didn't last as long. Now, during this time, when we're moving into the early 1970s, John's career is starting to taper off a little bit. He's going into musical theatre and so on. He's doing things, his recordings aren't having as much success as, Sadie, Underneath the Arches, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, which are all huge hits. This is when John met and befriended Glenn Wheatley. Now, Glenn Wheatley, as I said, he was in the Masters Apprentices who Darryl Samble managed, but he approached Darryl one day and he said, all your attention is on Johnny, I'm going to fire you. And he did, and took over the management himself. But it didn't mean Johnny and Wheatley actually shared a house together. They were good friends. And their bond was formed during Glenn's 21st. It was during summer. They'd been drinking all day. And Wheatley remembered that his mother had sent him a bottle of, he says Great Western, but I reckon it was Spumante. And he left it sitting on the back seat of his car. Now, I don't know about you, but that combination of sunshine and cheap sparkling wine doesn't normally sit so well. Regardless, John and Wheatley drank it, and 30 minutes later or so, John went looking for Wheatley and found him with his head down the toilet bowl. Now, John was concerned that Wheatley was drowning, and legend has it, and he has dined out on this story for the last 40 years, that he pulled Wheatley's head out of the toilet bowl, saved him from drowning, and their relationship, their bond was formed at that moment. Like I said, the 70s weren't kind to John on a commercial level. He was no longer king of pop, his music was no longer on the radio, and he was struggling to pay the bills. I remember it too. It was a time of Countdown was starting to become quite big, and it was about bands, it was about drag, and it was about skyhooks and people like that. Solo performers like Johnny Farnham was suddenly out of step. And if you remember seeing Johnny on early episodes of Countdown, he just didn't quite fit, and he certainly was it looks odd seeing him introducing a band like Skyhooks. They were from different generations altogether, even though they were of a similar age. John had also invested unwisely in a Melbourne restaurant called Backstage, bled money. On his fridge was a huge, as in numbers, unpaid tax bill that he looked at every time he went to get the milk. It's not really what you want to see. He had to sell his properties that he owned in order just to stay afloat. He diversified. He was in a sitcom called Bobby Dazzler. Does anybody remember that? Yeah, only a few of you. Well, there's a reason why. And sadly, in it, he played the part of a fading pop star. It was awkward typecasting. He did shifts as a radio DJ, he judged talent quests, he played the suburban beer barns to audiences more interested in pokies and beer than the guy on stage. He was supported by bands who didn't know his music. Now at this time, Glenn Wheatley, meanwhile, and their two stories are absolutely intertwined. Glenn Wheatley had gone on to great success managing the Little River Band, for Australia's first big band in America, selling millions of records, managed by Glenn. Glenn was coming home briefly, and he was going back to Melbourne, and his flight, this is Christmas Eve 1974, and his flight was going via Darwin. Of course, that was when Cyclone Tracy hit. His flight was diverted to the Gold Coast. He found out that night that Johnny was playing a show on the beach, and he went and saw him, and he was horrified by what he saw. Not by John's performance, but just by the lack of interest from the crowd and the bad band that John had. And John was still wearing the dinner suit on stage. And legend has it that after the show, Glenn went back, said hello, without saying a word to John, reached over, took the dinner suit off a peg, threw it in the bin and said, "That's the end of that." It took a few years, though, before Glenn actually proposed managing John's career, and by that time he desperately needed him. He had no manager, he was adrift. Glenn reappeared in his life in 1980. John had just performed the Beatles song Help on a Royal Gala performance. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but it was a big event. I think Chuck and Di were out, weren't they? It was at the Opera House. Helen Reddy, Peter Allen, Olivia Newton-John, Paul Hogan, they were all on the bill. But John performed the Beatles song in a totally different way. You're getting chills. Is it cold or is it the song? Yeah. And his performance of that, it was a totally reworked version of the song. A big ballad and really powerful, and he really owned the song. And it was probably the first time he proved to people that irrespective of whether he wrote a song, and John was not a songwriter, he could own a song. And this was a good example of that. And the several million people who watched that performance suddenly went, him, where has he been? He recorded a solo record with some members of LRB, and then a big change happened. Glenn Shorrock left the Little River Band. John had seen them a few years before in Las Vegas and was blown away by their performance, by the songs, by Glenn Shorrock himself, and by the way the audience responded. 10,000 people every night knew every word to every song. John had no idea back in Australia how successful LRB were. And he said, if Glenn Shorrock ever leaves the band, this is the band I want to join. The opportunity came up in 1980, and John did that. In fact, during that time, the mid-70s, the Don Lane show had proved a bit of an outlet for John, a bit of a lifeline. If you remember, he appeared dozens of times on the show. Well, the first time he appeared with the Little River Band was on the show, and I remember seeing it quite vividly. He was bursting out of his skin with excitement. This was something he really wanted, an opportunity to not just sing with Australia's best band, but to perform to big audiences all around the world. Because at the time, John had developed fans such as Stevie Wonder, Dionne Warwick. People like that spoke with incredible praise of John's vocal talents and said, why aren't you a star? Why aren't you a big international star? Well, suddenly this opportunity came up with LRB. And while to John it seemed like the perfect opportunity, he found out pretty quickly that it wasn't the same LRB that he'd seen a few years ago in Las Vegas. LRB was never, you hear about the great bands and they talk about them being bands of brothers and united. LRB was not that. LRB was a group of individual songwriters fighting with each other to get their own songs recorded by the band to go on these hugely successful records, because if you had a song on an LRB record, you're going to make a lot of money. So, and they weren't friends. They all had quite different, not different backgrounds, but just different mindsets, different attitudes to things, and everybody was competing with each other. Now, John, not being a natural songwriter, every now and again he would come up with a song, and the book's called Playing to Win, and I'll explain why. This was really John's, this is when he really found firsthand what life was really like in LRB. He brought this song into the studio called Playing to Win. And it's a terrific song. It's a real statement of intent. You know, we're going to get back on top, because also LRB's commercial stocks had started to decline a little bit. And this song for John represented a resurgence. They were going to get back on top. It was a really high energy song, and he sang it really well. And when he brought it into the studio, the rest of the band went, "It's great." And then they all started to pick it apart. Someone rewrote a line of lyrics. Someone restructured the melody. By the time the song that John had written came out of the studio, he only owned 52%. Someone else owned 8%. Someone owned 14%. And he was appalled. You know, it's like my song and you've dissected it like it was, you know, something on an operating table. Then another night, John was performing with the band, and anybody who's seen John performs knows how physical he is. He likes high energy. Particularly in the 70s and 80s, he'd run around the stage, really driven. Well, that was not the look that LRB wanted from their lead singer. And Glenn Shorrock, if you remember, he was quite static when he sang. Well, John one night took off for his usual lap of the stage and got a couple of meters down and pulled up like he'd been lassoed. Someone had shortened his microphone cable and not told him. There was that moment he went, "This is not the band for me." He left the band in 1985. Now, the interesting thing about all that experience is he played all around the world, played hundreds of shows with the band, recorded 3 albums, didn't make a cent, not 1 cent from his whole time with LRB. He came back to Australia and he said, I'm not interested anymore in becoming anything other than an Australian-based act. I want to stay here, I want to record here, I want to perform here. I'm not interested in becoming an international act. This has exposed me to the type of lifestyle required, because if you look at someone like Keith Urban, who I've also written about, he was the opposite. He said, I want to succeed in America and I'm willing to give up everything else in order to do that. By this time, John and his wife had had their first child. They were still settled in Melbourne. He said, I just don't want to give that up. So he decided to record a solo record. And at the time, no record company in Australia was interested. This is 1985. No one's interested in John Farnham. He was the guy who sang Sadie. He was the guy who wore the tuxedo. He was a novelty act from the 60s. He was the former king of pop. Glenn Wheatley went around to all the local record companies and they all said no. Glenn mortgaged his house and over the period of about 12 months pumped $150,000 into John's new recording. John was in his garage, not even a recording studio, living in a rented house in suburban Melbourne with his producer, the guy called Ross Fraser, a musician, a guy called David Hirschfelder, who'd been in LRB, and they set to work. Now, of course, John, not being a natural songwriter, was starting to look at songs from all around. Publishers would send him songs that they hoped he'd record. And they worked for about 12 months, and they had the majority of what became the Whispering Jack record finished. Now, there's a huge amount riding on this. Glenn Wheatley could quite literally lose his house. If the record didn't succeed, John's career was over. He'd have to go back to the building site. They still felt, though, there was missing one song. Now, of course, we all know what that song is, and I'll give you a bit of background to that. You're the Voice. John didn't write You're the Voice, but now as we talk about it, he owns You're the Voice. I think that's fair to say. The song was planned for a solo record, but not John Farnham's. A guy called Chris Thompson, who was a member of the Manfred Mann Earth Band, he was one of 4 co-writers of the song. The others were a guy called Keith Reid, who wrote the lyrics for Whiter Shade of Pale. You know that great song? There's lyricist for that. A member of the band Icehouse, a guy called Andy Quinter, and a woman named Maggie Ryder, who was a backup singer for Queen and the Eurythmics. So it was written by committee, if you like. In 1985, Chris Thompson went to his record company in England and said, I want to record this song. And they said, it's not commercial enough. No, don't do it. So what it became is sort of a song for hire. This quite often happens where they'll record a rough version of a song, put it on a cassette, send it to music publishers in the hope that, say, someone like a Rod Stewart or even a Tony Bennett, someone who doesn't write their own material but needs other songs to record, would record it. Eventually it found its way to John and his producer Russ Fraser. They'd listened to it a few times but put it into the bottom drawer. They really It wasn't really a song they wanted to do, but now they've recorded the rest of Whispering Jack, and John flashed back on the song and said, remember that one we listened to on the cassette, You're the Voice? And Fraser said yes, and he said, you know what it needs? And Fraser looked at him and said, no, and he said, bagpipes. Because John, as I said before, was an AC/DC fan, and he loved Long Way to the Top. It took a bit of convincing, but eventually Fraser relented, and they recorded it. So now the album's done, and they decide to have a listening session, which is what typically happens before an album is released. A record company has finally got on board. It's all set for a release. In the studio is John, his wife Gillian, Glenn Wheatley, Glenn's wife Gaynor Martin, the musicians who worked on the record, a small group. They play You're the Voice. Now, everybody knows at this point that this is a hit in waiting. But Glenn wasn't completely convinced that John had nailed it. They didn't say anything. John looked at Glenn, and Glenn looked at John, and had this kind of telepathic communication. And John went, okay. Picked up the headphones, told the producer to hit record, went into the recording booth, and re-recorded the song right there on the spot. And that's the vocal that we know today. And of course, the stats for that are staggering. I mean, the song was unstoppable. It became the biggest selling Australian song of 1986, even though it came out in September. So it was competing against songs that had been out for much, much longer. It was number one for 7 weeks, and oh, delicious irony, here's the man who doesn't want to become an international star. It's in the top 10 of the UK. It's a number one hit in Germany, Sweden, Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, throughout Europe. Not in America, interestingly, but it had made him a marquee name outside Australia for the first time in his career. The Voice, of course, has become now a key song for everything from big sports events to, you know, anything that needs a big song. It might have even inspired a certain popular TV show, if you get me, some karaoke competition. Now, Chris Thompson, the guy who wrote the song, eventually did get it back and recorded it in 1995, and everybody said, hey, isn't that a John Farnham song? Now, John's now rebuilt his career. Glenn Wheatley didn't have to lose his house. In early 1988, John's career couldn't seemingly get any bigger. Whispering Jack has rebranded him as a serious, mature, professional, a great singer, probably Australia's best singer. It's sold staggering amounts of copies. It's been on the charts. It's owned the charts for much of 1986 and 1987. In early 1988, Glenn Wheatley got a call from the Australia Council telling him quietly that John had been named Australian of the Year because he did a lot of charity work. And also, it was a very public return. If everybody remembers that time, John's comeback was a very public experience. You couldn't avoid him. You turn on the TV and there he was. He was all over the radio, of course. Now, there was a catch to this. Australian of the Year, what a great accolade. John was a POM. He actually hadn't taken Australian citizenship. And at the time, John was very reluctant to, because they said, well, we could organise it, but his wife was pregnant with their second child. John's influence was such at the time that they sent a Canberra bureaucrat to his house, and he became an Australian in his dining room, which I don't think many people have been able to do. Now, if you remember Australia Day 1988, it was the 200th anniversary of the First Fleet. It was a big event. I remember in Sydney, it was huge. There were the tall ships on the harbour, there was helicopters overhead, there was a big TV broadcast, and John as Australian of the Year was right in the thick of it. I also remember quite vividly that Bob Hawke, as he tended to do, was also right in the thick of it, getting a little bit emotional too. And there's one wonderful bit of footage that I saw when I was researching the book where John and his mate Hawkey, best mate, sitting there together, and Hawkey, getting very emotional, reaches over and expresses what a great connection he has with his buddy Johnny, and he grabs John's hand. And the look on Farnham's face is perfect. Like, okay, he's great, I love you, but this is way too personal. So it couldn't get any bigger than that. I mean, John's now Australian of the Year. So he had to find a way. Sometimes in performers' careers, the biggest challenge is not getting on top, but staying on top. How do you get to that point and continue to do that, which he has actually successfully done for the last 30 years? What he did, and it was quite smart, and this again is a huge part of Glenn Wheatley's influence on John, is that he'd drop in and out of the spotlight. He wasn't overexposed. In the background, though, life is good. For the first time in his life, he's got money. For the first time, he's made some real money from music. He and the family had a condo at Sanctuary Cove where they holidayed with the Wheatleys and the Scases. John and his family found a rural retreat. They began raising horses. As I said, he dined at the lodge with Hawking and raided his wine cellar. He'd disappear every now and again, and he'd re-emerge. First it was Age of Reason, and then it was Chain Reaction. What he would do is then he would do a concert tour, and those concert tours would break the records that John himself had set last time he toured. It was almost as though he was competing with himself. No other Australian act at that time came even close to achieving what he did as a recording and concert performer. He decided to indulge himself a little bit. He toured Queensland by rail. Does anybody remember that? He hired a Queensland rail train and just travelled around to places a little bit off the map. He did a big top tour of the Outback, which was kind of Slim Dusty style, going to some really remote places. Like I say, he and Wheatley mastered the art of maintaining their audience, always give 100% on stage, always come back with something slightly new. He rarely played the same series of concerts twice. He'd always change it up a bit. But by the early 2000s, things were changing for Glenn Wheatley. He'd built a sizable media empire. He owned the Hoyts Corporation, as I found out. But he'd lost, just like John, he'd lost considerable money in a nightclub in Wheatley's instance, and was forced to sell his assets. Now, when Wheatley agreed to manage John in 1980, they sat down, two mates, and Glenn said to John, "What do you need to keep you afloat?" And John said, $50,000, and Glenn gave him a check. No questions asked. The tables were now turned. John and Wheatley had lunch, and John said to Wheatley, "You're in financial trouble, aren't you?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "What do you need?" And he said, $300,000. And John gave it to him. That was the connection they had between them. But then it got worse for Wheatley. It came under the scrutiny of the tax office. If you remember Operation Wickenby, I think they were also after Paul Hogan and a bunch of other high-profile people. What Wheatley had done is he'd taken bad advice, buried $400,000 offshore, and got caught. What he then did, in a testimony to the guy, he came clean. He told the tax office everything that happened. He paid that amount back as his bill. He didn't try to hide behind lawyers, as most of the other people in that sting did. And the tax office said, "It's okay, you won't get a sentence." But then they reneged on the deal and he got 18 months in jail. Now, John, their relationship was such that John said, "I refuse to perform if Glenn's not standing by the stage." So John basically went into a sort of accidental retirement. It also might have something to do with the fact with every night that John plays, Glenn stands side stage with what's known as a bottle of fighting brandy that John likes to have a nip of before he goes, or maybe two, before he goes on stage. So it's a ritual that they had, but it's much more than that. He said, "I refuse to perform if Glenn's not there." He'd go and visit Wheatley in jail. Now, while it was a great gesture on his part, it also complicated things for Glenn, because the prisoners who mightn't know that situation suddenly went, "Why is John Farnham visiting you?" And it caused him a lot of hassle in prison. Wheatley finally got out of jail in 2008, and John went back on the road. This was the beginning of what you might call his Dame Nellie Melba period, where every tour, every record was going to be, every question he was asked by probing journalists were, "When are you going to retire?" Never, ever name a record the last time, is my advice, because it seemed to suggest something. But he loved touring. He even took his son's band out with him to tour one time. To me, it's unlikely that he would ever give up touring while he still has the voice that he has and the desire to perform and, frankly, the ability to fill houses from coast to coast. I most recently saw him, I know he's touring now, but I most recently saw him in late 2015. It was one of the final shows at the Sydney Entertainment Centre before it went under the wrecking ball. And it was the first big show for my son, who's 8. My daughter, her first big show was Alice Cooper. My son's was John Farnham. Draw your own conclusions from that. I'm going to read you, just finish before we go into questions and things, I'm going to read you a little passage that describes that concert and just kind of hopefully captures the mood of that show. It's called Jack's Back. So it's mid-December 2015 and we're in the Sydney Entertainment Centre. John Farnham owned this stage. Great acts such as Dire Straits and Elton John may have performed here many, many times, but the Sydney Entertainment Centre, currently the Qantas Credit Union Arena, belonged to Farnham. Don't you hate when they do? They do it everywhere, don't they? Yeah. What do you guys got at the moment? Is it the Suncorp Stadium? Is that all? Just Suncorp Stadium? Yeah, no, but I mean, it's probably called Suncorp, such and such credit union, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, as of mid-December 2015, John had played 77 concerts at the Entertainment Centre, which was Guinness Book of Records stuff. But some things had changed since he first trod the boards here in 1983. His once golden mane was a little close crop, probably showing a bit more scalp than hair these days. And a number of clothes sizes have been added amidships. The dryzer bone was in the back of the wardrobe along with the leather pants, replaced by a dapper black dinner jacket. His look was more gracefully aging Vegas crooner than middle-aged pop star, and he seemed totally cool with that. He was comfortable in his own skin, finally. But what hadn't changed one bit was his voice. If anything, he seemed to be singing now better than ever, taking songs to places they'd never been before. It was remarkable to watch, a master going about his craft. The die-hard Farnham fan base, which with the passing of time had been more stable than the Rock of Gibraltar, loved every single minute of it. From the moment he walked on stage singing Age of Reason, they went crazy. A Farnham concert at this time, 2015, but I'm sure still today, was pitched somewhere between a Hillsong revival meeting, but with better songs, and Elvis in Vegas in the early 1970s. He was singing the soundtrack to the lives of the 12,000 people in the room and the millions of other fans, and they responded with the type of mad love usually reserved for winning footy teams. I remember at one moment my son just looked around and was like, "What is this?" Surprisingly, there were a lot of under-30s in the audience who were going just as mad for the big songs as the over-60 set. It seemed that the words Farnham and uncool had just drifted apart over the years. Even the critics had got on board now. But he still had his on-stage patter perfected, his willingness to share his inner dag with his faithful audience. In a blink, he could shift from a heartfelt ballad to a mother-in-law joke. He'd chat to the audience of 12,000 people as if he'd just bumped into them down the shops. Tonight, he casually mentioned a significant moment that had happened just before the show when he'd been given the lofty sign from the Farnham Room, the Entertainment Centre's green room. He recalled looking out at the audience. Jelly looked at me and looked at the sign as if to say, "Where are you going to put that?" He made it seem as though being presented with a chunk of the Sydney Entertainment Centre was a perfectly ordinary occurrence. Not only did he own the stage, he now owned a chunk of the building. At 66, he could still talk the talk of everyday Australia. He bantered a bit about the missus, joked about his age, and took cheap shots at his manager, at one point chastising him for not juicing up his water bottle. "Bloody Wheatley," he said. And while his set was now really mainly songs from Whispering Jack and beyond, it only took 15 minutes or so before the first request rang out. "Play Sadie." Bugger it, he laughed. "You asked for it." But then he stopped. "You know," he said, "I don't hate this song, not at all," which dispelled a popular myth. "Sadie's the reason I'm standing here tonight." Then after a beat he said, "It's just not the best song I've ever recorded." With another laugh, he began reminiscing a song about the woman with her red detergent hands, and the crowd lapped it up. All of this was evidence, if it was still required, that John Farnham's popularity was constant, regardless of his many, many farewells and last times. The lure of performing was just too strong. So here he was, 2015, mid-60s, still every inch the singer's singer, a regular guy who took simple pleasure in the thrill that hit him when he opened his mouth and let rip. He'd been doing this now for 50 years, so why give up when he was loved with so much fervour, when there was so much goodwill in the air and never an empty seat in the house? His audience was going nowhere, nor was he. John Farnham was, and probably will always be, the voice. There you are. That's the story. Now, there must be questions, surely. Repeat that question, because that's the perfect opener, actually. I've got a good story.
Does John Farnham still accept the book, or does he now accept the book?
I don't think he's read it. I don't think he's a voracious reader, particularly of books with his name on the front cover. I would like to think, I certainly know that Glenn privately, Glenn Wheatley has endorsed the book, and I think people have approached Glenn about doing his life story as a mini-series because they know that they'll never get John's, but they know if they get Glenn's, they get John's by association. Look, I didn't write this book for John Farnham. As I said before, I wrote this book for people who may know his music, may know, the character John Farnham, if you like, the public figure, but don't know what was involved in him. Firstly, this roller coaster ride of a career. So I'm probably more concerned I probably feel a deeper connection when people respond to me, readers respond to me. Sure, I'd love to get John's, sign off on the book. That'd be lovely because I could whack his name on the front cover and probably sell some more copies. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say I didn't write it for him. Maybe one day he'll pick it up. I hope so. Maybe in his retirement, if that ever happens. He'll need a bit of weekend reading. So hopefully this might be the book. But, the response to it's been really good. Although I will say that I talk about his die-hard fans, and they are very die-hard. There are quite a few of them who said, John hasn't endorsed it, I'm not going to read it. And I have suggested to them, don't buy it, just go to the library and borrow it. But I always, I get a lot of, through the world of social media and so on, you always, as a writer, you get a lot of feedback, and I've certainly don't try to hide away. I have a very public profile. And I always say to the naysayers, try to read the book first. If you still don't like it, then I'm okay with that. I'm perfectly fine with it. But don't have a response based purely on a reaction to someone else's comment. Base it on your own opinion. And the book is, it says unauthorized, but it's not. The word unauthorized has such a kind of nasty connotation. I mean, I just want my books, maybe the best word to use for some of my books, not all of them, is unofficial. That seems a less kind of seedy tag. But, I mean, there are a lot of writers. I always think of the royal biographer, Andrew Morton, who always seems to, and Kitty Kelly, they always seem to set out with this agenda, to strip bare some public figure. I don't have the stomach or the inclination for that, No, well, no, in this case, certainly not, But, there's certain books I've written and people have said, oh, you could have had all these dark and dangerous stories. And some of them do, but I'm much more interested in my subjects. I'm not trying to grind an axe, So, that word really sits uncomfortably. Actually, I'm going to use unofficial from now on, if in fact I have to. But no, he hasn't read it. I think he would reluctantly enjoy it. Oh, yes, I won't forget.
Did you read any other books like Jane Gazzo's book in the lead up to writing yours?
No, actually, that's a good story. I wasn't aware of it. I had actually started work on this when I found out that Jane's book came out. And I actually went to my publisher and said, I don't think, two books within 12 months of each other. And they were quite confident that it would stand up. I deliberately, and for no real reason other than nothing worse than reading someone else's work, because inevitably there's going to be 2, sometimes there's 10 books on a subject, and finding out that you're tracing. Have you read her book? Have you read my book? Are they obviously very similar? Of course, yeah. Well, that's what I was wary of, because nothing worse than and I was in the middle of writing this when that book came out, and I thought, if I read this and find similar things are repeated, it's just going to do my head in, In time I will read it, I hope to, but I think Jane came from a fan's perspective. Yeah, I guess I came from more of a biographer's perspective. It's slightly different, yeah. Although, as you say, when you're writing about a real life, and a life lived quite publicly, it's pretty hard. Hopefully my narrative's a bit more lively. Yeah. Now, you had a story, didn't you? Please.
This has nothing to do. Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry, I'm not used to speaking. Nothing to do on microphones. Nothing to do with the book. I haven't read it, but
it's over there.
It's a
available.
personal memory. I grew up in Melbourne, and when I finished high school, I had a choice of going to Melbourne or Monash Uni. I thought, Monash is closer. I'll go there. The first year, I did nothing except had fun, because I came from a very, very strict and sheltered household. The second year of uni was interesting in that I branched out a little bit further. One of the things we did, my boyfriend at the time had a high school friend who was ended up in politics. Theo Salopis, something, some Greek guy. He was some scandal, he had to retire. Anyway, this Theo had an idea. Let's publish a magazine. Okay, what do we do? Oh, we'll go and find out what to do, and we'll contact a few people and we'll call it Albert Sebastian. I have no idea why, but we had the cover. We issued 2 editions, and in the first edition was a competition. All you had to do was give a reason why you wanted to have lunch with John Farnham. I can't remember what happened to that. We had millions and millions of entries from these 14-year-old girls, and at the time, I can't remember what year it was. It would have been mid-60s. But before we did that, we went to a lot of parties. And one of the parties I went to was held somewhere. The party was pretty boring. All these people were drunk and being stupid. And so I went to the front of the house. It was a very ordinary house. I don't know whose place it was. Anyway, there's no one in the lounge room except this kid sitting on the corner on the floor playing this guitar. Hey. And I sat and I listened. I thought, oh, you're so good. So when he stopped, I said, you're incredible. You've got such a voice and you've got the guitar. I said, do you do this for a living? Oh, no, I just do it for fun. And I said, what's your name? Oh, John. And I had talked to him, and it was John Farnham. And I didn't think anything of it until this Albert Sebastian magazine took off. And somewhere around the time, we got to know all these people who Jeff mentioned. Molly Meldrum was running Countdown on the 2nd floor of some place in the city, and we watched rehearsals, and that was just incredible. Maggie Burns was a choreographer, married to Ronnie Burns, and we met and we watched all these shows that were recorded. It was just absolutely magical. And as part of the research for this crazy magazine, we had to interview John Farnham's parents. And I thought, okay, this will be fine. They're probably nice people. They lived, I've forgotten where they lived, Preston or?
Yeah, suburban,
yeah,
like
some
newly
little
suburban,
working class
yeah.
place. You open the front door and there's the lounge room, you sit down. So we sat down, we asked a few questions, and they were the nicest people. They were very simple, very ordinary, very humble. And they said, oh, we don't like this, we don't like the fact that he's, doing all these things, there's no security in it. We don't know what's going to happen, but we'll do what we can to guide him. And as it turns out, I think they stayed in that house even when John shot to stardom. He offered to buy them whatever they wanted, anywhere. No, we've lived here forever. We're going to stay in that house. And that's all I remember.
When I was speaking in Wynnum, one of the first talks I did the other day, and a woman, we were talking about experiences like that meeting and so on, and this woman was telling me that she'd gone to Eagle Farm Airport to see the monkeys arrive. This is 1967, right? And she had Davy written on her leg, and, she was ready to go. And someone pulled her up, and she was there with a girlfriend, and someone pulled her up and said, there's thousands of kids there, and she said, did you know that John Farnham was sitting over there in the TAA lounge by himself? And they both went, really? So they, figuring we're never going to get to meet the monkeys, but we're going to meet John Farnham. They went over there, and he was the nicest man. He signed their arm. He spent ages with them. And I thought, it's a lovely story. That night I was talking in Carindale, and she said, this is my girlfriend from school, and, we've gone. I said, oh, do you keep in touch? No, I haven't seen her again. That night in Carindale, a similar situation, I'd finished my talk, and this woman said, oh, I have this photo. And I said, oh, what's that? And she said, it's my friend and I at Eagle Farm Airport meeting John Farnham. And I said, did he sign your arm? Were you there to see the monkeys? And she said, yeah. And I said, have you seen this woman since then? She said, no, I haven't seen her since we were kids. It's like, I just met her 2 hours ago. But imagine, she had the photo of the story. It was amazing. So I think people who become Farnham fans for life. There's definitely no change. Monkeys, not so sure. They're still going. There is a version of the monkeys still going. Terrific. Were there any other questions? Yes.
I just thought I'd say I saw John and the Little River Band in about 1980, 1981.
Yes?
And at Whispers, which was a nightclub in the Valley.
Yeah.
Remember that? And there weren't a lot of people in there.
No, well, it was kind
And
of them starting to break him in, if you like.
That was the start,
Yeah,
was it?
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Because they did go on to
Alright.
do quite a big, but like I said, commercially they just started to slow. The best footage of Little River Band with John Farnham, and it's worth YouTubing, is on the show Solid Gold. Do you remember that show? The American TV show? I think Andy Gibb hosted it for a while. And it's mid-1980s, and they're playing the song Playing to Win. And they're trying to change their look. Little River Band were always, you know, collared shirts and blue jeans and, you know, mullets, sort of pseudo-mullets, but nothing too flashy. But, you know, they were just regular guys. At this point, they're trying to rebrand themselves both musically and visually. And a guy called David Hirschfelder, who became a big player in John's career, he was in the band, and he had the uber mullet, like this epic, you know, it was blonde tips, but it was shoulder length, and he's playing. John's got the cut-off sleeves going at that point, but David Hirschfelder is wearing a silver suit, but it's more like a kind of space suit. And he's playing one of those keyboard guitars, you know, the keyboard axes. And there's a moment in the song where he jumps to center stage, and it looked like they'd been invaded by an alien, I swear. And it was so un-LRB. You know, even Graham Goble had taken to wearing these big kind of space specs. Everything about it. John looked great, admittedly, but it just didn't fit. You know, it was just a bad fit all round. So I'd recommend it, but don't look too closely. It's, you know, don't look at it on a full stomach. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Cool. If there's no other questions, I'm going to be hanging around. If anybody buys the book, I'm happy to sign it and so on. Or I'm sure someone will come up with questions after, inevitably. So I'll be around here for a little while. Thank you very much, Aaron. I appreciate it.